Well, at this time, the children are dismissed to junior church. According to the Barna Research Group, tithing remained stable in 2012, though it was typically in a lower range. The research shows that 5% of adults qualify as having tithe, that is, giving 10% or more of their annual income to a church or a nonprofit organization. In 2009, before the financial crisis, tithing was at 7%, then it dipped to 4% in 2010 and 2011. Among born-again Christians, which includes evangelicals and non-evangelicals, 12% tithe in 2012, which is on a par with the average for the past decade. Now, that as our subject is tithing, and you can look at the statistics that the Barna Group has developed, and this is obviously a few years old, but nevertheless, it gives us some interesting statistics. And we can be thankful for the 12% of the Christians who give 10% or more of their income to the church. But what becomes glaringly obvious when you look at those statistics is that 88% of the Christians do not give 10% of their income to the church. Which is a sad statistic when you consider that the church has taught tithing for centuries. I mean, it's been a staple even back with Augustine and the early church fathers. There was the teaching of tithing, and you come all the way down to the day, and only 12%. And actually, I've heard statistics that really say probably 5%. But why? Here's the church says a Christian should tithe, but very few Christians actually practice it. Which then makes me wonder, how many other doctrines, how many other truths, how many other practices does the church teach? And the vast majority of Christians don't obey. Makes me wonder how much of that is true. Well, in our study of stewardship, we come this morning to the subject of tithing in the Old Testament. And we've been working now for the last 6 weeks in tithing, and just to kind of give you a quick review to help you keep these things in mind. First of all, when we talk about a steward, remember that a steward is one who manages the property of another. It is not your property. It belongs to someone else, and you simply manage that which has been given to you. That's what a steward does. But we have discovered that, first of all, we are given the stewardship over all of creation. We as human beings have a responsibility to stewardship over all of creation and the management of it and to the glory of God. We've also discovered that God is the source of all the blessings. Every blessing that you possess, every possession that you have, any amount of money you have is a gift of God, and you are thus responsible for the stewardship of what you do with what God has blessed you with. We looked at the parables on stewardship from Jesus, and we found that we should be shrewd in our stewardship, but we also found that there is a reward for good stewardship and a rebuke for poor stewardship. We also discovered that we are stewards of the days of our lives. Each of us have been allotted so many days to live upon the face of this earth. We're given a specific number of days. And what we do with those days is our stewardship. We should be living wisely, redeeming the time, because the time is growing short We should be living with eternity's values in view. But we've also looked and discovered that we are stewards of the manifold grace of God. And particularly, we think of the grace gifts. Each of us have been given a charismata, a grace gift, to be used to build the church up. So when God calls you to be born again, when God saved you, you were given with the Holy Spirit a gift, a particular gift, that you are supposed to be, as a steward, using that gift to build the church up. You've been given a gift. It's your stewardship to make sure that you use the gift to accomplish the purpose that God would have you to accomplish. But we're also been given the grace of the gospel. Gospel of grace, which we are to take to the whole world. And you and I have a stewardship to proclaim the gospel of grace. And we also have a stewardship to make sure that the gospel is pure. That it is the gospel of Jesus Christ. The pure gospel of Jesus Christ. We have a responsibility, a stewardship to make sure that the gospel is proclaimed, but that it is a pure gospel. And also there's the need for, as stewards of the manifold grace of God, to extend grace to everyone. As Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15:10, I am what I am by the grace of God. And he goes on and says what he does by the grace of God. But we've also been looking at that we have discovered there's some principles from the Old Testament about stewardship and about giving. And particularly, giving is a heart issue. It has to do with your heart. And giving should flow out of a heart that loves God and gives in a response to that love. It's also to be free will, voluntary. Nobody tells you what to do or how to do it. You just do it because you want to. You give based upon what you receive. If you receive $20 this week, you give based upon $20. If you got $20,000 this week, you give based upon the $20,000 you got. We also found, as we looked at this, that there is also a principle that God's people have a responsibility to support the Lord's house. That you have a responsibility to make sure that the functioning and the services of the Lord's house is carried out. Well, this morning we want to look at the practice of tithing, and particularly whether you and I should be tithing. The origins of the tithe. Turn with me to Genesis chapter 14, verse 20. And when we find this is the first time the word tithe is used in the Bible. And we find it with Abraham. Now, Abraham has just gone and rescued his nephew Lot, and he is returning from the victory after defeating the kings. And we read in verse 18, it says, Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abraham, God of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. So Melchizedek has come out, and he pronounces this blessing upon Abraham. And notice what it says, and he gave him a tithe of all. Now that Hebrew word means 1/10. So all the spoils that Abraham got from the defeat of the kings, he gives to Melchizedek, the priest of the Most High God, 1/10 of it. And so we find that. He paid the 10th part. Now, you know, it says, we're not really sure what prompted Abraham to give Melchizedek a tenth. It's not clear in the passage that God said to Abram, this is what you need to do. It seems to be, it flows out of something Abraham understood, but we're not given clear revelation as how he understood that. It seems to be that it was a practice that was practiced by peoples in that day and time. It was clearly, what he gives, the 10th, was clearly because God had blessed him. It flows out of the blessing that God had given to him, and so he gives to God a 10th. Now, the next place we find this word used is in Genesis 28. Turn over a few pages to chapter 28. And this is the story of Jacob. He's leaving his home. He's going back to where his mother came from, her land. And as he has this encounter with God at Bethel, the house of God, he has the vision of Jacob's ladder and all of that. And this is the promise that Jacob makes. He says to God in 22, "And this stone which I have set up is a pillar, shall be house of God, God's house. And all that you give me, I will surely give a tenth to you." So here is Jacob. He's about to leave his own land. He leaves his home country with nothing. He's going to a far country, and he anticipates being there and that God will bless him. And he makes the promise that if God will bless him, I will give you a tenth upon his return. And so here you have this promise that Jacob makes. And again, we do not know what prompts him to say, I will give a tithe. I will give a tenth. But he is. Now, one thing that is clear as one studies it is the fact that it was an established custom amongst the ancient peoples to give a tithe. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia says, "The custom of giving a tenth part of the products of the land and of the spoils of war to priests and kings was a very ancient one among most nations." So this is a very ancient custom. And this idea of giving a tenth part to either to a deity or to a king or a priest as a result of being blessed. The Smith's Bible Dictionary says, "These instances bear witness to the antiquity of the tithes, and in some shape or other previous to the Mosaic tithe system. But the numerous instances are to be found for the practice of the heathen nations, Romans and Greeks and Carthaginians and Arabs, applying a tenth derived from the property in general, from the spoils and from confiscated goods and from commercial profits to sacred purposes as a tribute to a deity." And so it seems to be, and we are not given revelation. There is no revelation in Scripture where we find how these people came to this conclusion. But by the time of the patriarchs, it is an established custom amongst all the peoples that you would give a tenth part to a deity. It's established their deities were not the God of the Bible, but nevertheless it was established. And we find then, here's Abraham, who gives a tenth of his spoils to the priest Melchizedek, who is the priest of the Most High God. And here we have Jacob, who comes along a little later, and he makes the promise that he will tithe the blessings that he receives in the far land. Now, what was the custom, the general custom amongst all the peoples to take a tenth part and give it to a priest or to a deity or to a king, becomes codified in the Mosaic law. And as the law is given, we find that it becomes now codified. It becomes one of the laws or part of the laws of the land of Israel. And to begin with, we look at Leviticus chapter 27 and verses 30 through 33. It says, "In all the tithe of the land, whether the seed of the land or the fruit of the tree is his fruit, it is holy to the Lord. If a man wants to redeem any of his tithe, he shall add 1/5 to it, according to the tithe of the herd of the flock. Whatever passes under the rod, the 10th one shall be holy to the Lord. He shall not inquire whether it is good or bad, nor whether shall he exchange it. If he exchanges it at all, then both it and the one exchanged shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed." And so we find these instructions about the tithe. It was a tithe of the land. It was required. All the tithe of the land. It belonged to God. The people lived upon the land. The people raised crops upon the lands. They raised herds upon the land, and a tithe was required. It was holy. It was sacred. It was set apart to the Lord. So 1/10 of all the produce of the land, whether it be fruits and vegetables, whether it be grains, or whether it be livestock, were God's. They were to give that to God. That is the Old Testament Mosaic law. Now this tithe we find, if you were to look in Leviticus 18, is particularly given to the Levites. Leviticus 18, 21 and 24. And you shall not let any of your descendants pass. Wait a minute. Oh, Numbers, I'm sorry. I thought that didn't look right. Numbers 18. Numbers 18. He says, Behold, I have given the children of Levi all the tithes in Israel as an inheritance in return for the work which they performed, the work of the tabernacle meeting. Hereafter the children of Israel shall not come near the tabernacle meeting lest they bear sin and die. But the Levites shall perform the work of the tabernacle meeting, and they shall bear their iniquity, and it shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that among the children of Israel they have no inheritance. For the tithes of the children of Israel, which they offer up as a heave offering to the Lord, I have given to the Levites as an inheritance. Therefore I have said to them, among the children of Israel they shall have no inheritance. So this tithe that is required, that belongs to God, God took and gave it to the Levites as their inheritance. They did not receive any land inheritance. There were certain towns and villages they were designated to live in, but as far as actual possession of property, land, they were not given any. What they received was they were to live off the tithe that the people gave. They were supposed to live off that tithe. That's what God's purpose was. Now, of that tithe that the Levites received, they were supposed to tithe to the priest. And we read in Numbers chapter 18 and verse 25, it says, Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak thus to the Levites, and say to them, When you take from the children of Israel the tithes which I have given you from them as your inheritance, then you shall offer up a heave offering to the Lord, 1/10 of the tithe. And your heave offering shall be reckoned to you as though it were a grain of the threshing floor, as of the fullness of the winepress. Thus you shall also offer up a heave offering to the Lord for all your tithes, which you received from the children of Israel, and you shall give the heave offering to Aaron and the priest. And so, there was supposed to be a tithe of all the produce of the land. That tithe was given to the Levites. The Levites, in turn, were then to tithe of the tithe to support the priest. That is the way God set it up. That's the way God intended. And that's what is written here within the Mosaic Law. That was what was called the first tithe. But there is a second tithe, and if you would turn with me to Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22, you'll find that there is a second tithe that is prescribed and required. He says, You shall truly tithe all the increase of your grain that the fields produce year by year. And you shall eat before the Lord your God in the place where he chooses to make his name abide, the tithe of your grain, of your new wine, of your oil, and the firstborn of your herds, of your flocks, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. But if the journey is too long for you, so that you are not able to carry the tithe, or if the place where the Lord your God chooses to put his name is too far from you, then the Lord your God has blessed you, then you shall exchange it for money. Take the money in your hand and go to the place where the Lord your God chooses, and you shall spend that money for whatever your heart desires, for oxen, for sheep, for wine, or similar drink, or whatever your heart desires, and you shall therefore before the Lord, eat therefore before the Lord God, and you shall rejoice your house. Behold, and you shall not forsake the Levite who is within your gates, for he has no part of inheritance with you. And so now here is, you have the first tithe, or the general tithe, but now here is a second tithe that it comes as it is to be a part of the festival, what is called a festival tithe. You were to take, of the 9/10 that you have remaining, you were to take 1/10 of that, and you were to go to the place of the tabernacle, or to go to the place of the temple, and you were to celebrate. You were to have a feast. Now, if you were close enough and you could carry your grain and your animals and all the food that you would need for the great big festival, that was fine. But if you lived too far away, you could sell your grain, you could sell your animals, you could sell your produce in change for money. And then you would bring the money to Jerusalem or wherever the place, Shiloh, and there you would buy the required sacrifice. You'd buy a lamb or a goat or an ox. You would buy the grain that you would need for the meal. You would buy all the wine that you would need for the meal. Everything you would need for a festival meal you would buy. And whatever you had left over was given to the Levites. And so this second tithe is required. There's the first tithe, but then there's this festival tithe that you were supposed to tithe and to use to purchase or provide for the festival meal in celebration of one of the great feasts in Jerusalem. But then there is also then a third tithe. Look with me, 14:28 in Deuteronomy. He says, at the end of every third year, you shall bring out the tithe of your produce of that year and store it up within your gates. And the Levite, because he has no portion nor inheritance with you, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow who are within your gates may come and eat and be satisfied, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hand which you do. So every 3 years, a tithe was to be stored up within whatever village you lived. If you lived in Bethlehem, you would bring that tithe to Bethlehem. If you lived in Nazareth, you would bring that tithe to Nazareth, and it would be stored up, and it would be then distributed over the next 3 years to the poor people. It was a benevolent tithe. These are the requirements that are given. Now the question is, were there 2 tithes or 3 tithes? Now, scholars debate this issue of just exactly how many tithes are required under the Mosaic law. Josephus, the Jewish historian, and other Jewish scholars support the idea that there were 3 tithes. That there was, the first tithe was given to the Lord for the support of the Levites. There was the festival tithe that was given to pay for the festival meal and sacrifices in Jerusalem. And then there was the poor tithe given every 3 years to support the poor. Now others would say there were only 2. And that the poor tithe was, they took the festival tithe and rather than use it to buy the meal and to celebrate the feast, they gave that to the poor. But this is the law of the tithe. All these things are regulated and given to us here in the writings of Moses. It is obvious that it is a part of Jewish worship, part of the Jewish government. Now, practiced and passed on down through the centuries, but we find that by the time you get to Jesus, and you get to the New Testament, this whole idea, it had become very legalistic. And there was a lot of legalism. In Luke chapter 11, verse 42, Jesus shares this insight about tithing. This is amidst the woe upon the Pharisees, who were the legalists, the hypocritical legalists of the day. It says, "But woe to you Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and all manner of herbs, and pass by justice and love of God. These ought you have to have done without leaving the others undone." So here he is, Jesus is pronouncing this woe upon the Pharisees, because they make a big deal out of tithing of their herbs. How many of you have got an herb garden? Anybody here got an herb garden? Nobody has an herb garden. Well, a lot of people got herb gardens. My sister-in-law out in California, she's got an herb garden. But anyway, They would make a big deal. Oh, I'm tithing of my mint. I'm tithing of my cumin. I'm tithing of whatever spices. And they made a big deal. Oh, I'm really holy because I give even of my herbs. But the problem is they went through the legalism. They went through all this. Oh yes, I'm tithing, I'm giving all these things. But they neglected, as Jesus said, justice and love of God. The Matthew passage, which of course says they neglected justice, mercy, and faith. So you see, outwardly, oh yeah, here's my tithe, here's my deal. Here's a tenth of all the deal that I raised. It's yours, God. Oh, here's a tenth of the mint that I raised. It's yours. But they neglected justice. And they neglected love for God and love for people. They neglected faith. And so you see, as Jesus reveals to us here, this whole practice of tithing has become very legalistic. It has become a source of self-righteousness. Now, Luke 18, if you turn over a few pages, we also find this story, and we find that the Pharisee bragging. Jesus tells this story. He also spoke this parable to some who trusted in themselves. This is in verse 9 of chapter 18. That they were righteous and despised others. Okay, so he's speaking it to those who trusted in themselves in their self-righteousness. He says, 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed with himself. Interesting to me, he says with himself. He's not really praying to God, he's praying with himself. God's probably not even involved in this. He's praying with himself. But nevertheless, he says, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. The tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Well, you see, this Pharisee is bragging. I give tithes of all that I possess. It has become a work of self-righteousness. It has become a legalistic thing, and he doing that, he makes him better than everybody else because he gives the tithe. You see, this whole idea of tithing, which was originally in the Old Testament an act of worship, has now become a means of self-righteousness. That by tithing you could make yourself righteous. It was something you could do and brag about. It was no longer a sign of worship and devotion, but a legalistic practice that promoted self-righteousness. And that's one of the things that happened after the captivity in a period of time while they wanted to restore true Judaism. They really all devolved down into very legalistic practice. And so you have the Pharisees whom Jesus pronounces woe upon. And a part of the legalism was this idea of giving a tithe. And that they were very legalistic about it, and it was seen as a means of attaining righteousness, as being declared righteous because they gave a tithe. And so we find it here at this point in history as a very legalistic thing. Now the question is, and as we get into this, is tithing for the church today? And that is the question. And just some observations that I would make on that is, first of all, you need to understand that in its origin, tithing was tied to land use. Merle Unger called it a feudal duty rent paid to God who owned the land. So we need to understand that in its original concept, in its original institution within the Mosaic law, it was tied to land use. God gave them the land. God required them thus to give a tenth back to him, which he used to support the Levites who were to take care of the tabernacle and see to the worship center. But nevertheless, it was tied to the land use. God gave them the land, and they were required then to, a land use tax, if you would, of 1/10 of all the produce of the land, which he gave to Levites who received no land inheritance. Now, many of you probably practice similar things today. Many of you own farm property, and somebody else farms it for you, don't they? And what do you expect? You get a return. It's your property, somebody else is using your property, and they are supposed to return to you a certain percentage of the produce of the land. And so when the originating tithing was tied to this land use. The land was given to Israel, and Israel was to give God a portion, 1/10 of the produce of that land. Now, we as Christians are not given a land. There is no Christian land. Our home is in heaven. Our inheritance is in heaven. There is no Christian land promises. So therefore, any regulations that have to do with land use could not apply to our situation, because there is no Christian land. We don't give them a land. The nation of Israel is there. It's in the same place it's been for thousands of years, given to them by God. But there is no Christian land. We are not promised that. I'm promised a home in heaven, and my inheritance lies in heaven. A second observation that is, we will continue our study, will become more clear, but just to observe is the fact the church is not taught to tithe. John Walford and Roy Zuck in the Bible Knowledge Commentary observe, tithing is not commanded in the New Testament. Randy Alcorn in his book, The Treasure Principle, observes, there is no mention of tithing after the Gospels. It is neither commanded nor rescinded. And as we continue our study, particularly the next time we look at this subject, we'll be looking at Jesus' teachings, and then we will look also at the teachings of Paul, and you will find that it's not mentioned. Christians are not required to tithe. We do not have to obey the Mosaic law. So now, what are we supposed to do? What are we as Christians supposed to do? I mean, this is kind of all pretty confusing. That probably kind of got you all confused, because it's a little more complicated than what we often are taught. Now, if you're like me, most of my life as a Christian, I've been taught a Christian should tithe 10% of their income to the Lord. And to teach against that seems really radical. Now, there are churches, if I were to share this message with them, I would be considered a heretic, because I'm teaching that the tithe is not required for Christians. So, it's really pretty confusing sometimes, and like I say, a lot of places they just label me right out a heretic because I've said that the tithing is not required of the church. Yet, it's interesting that while the church has taught it and pounded away at it since, like I say, the early church fathers, according to Barna, only 12% of born-again Christians tithe. So there's a great gulf be what we teach and hold and say is the truth, and what we actually do. Well, let's try to make some sense of this subject of tithing. First of all, we need to realize that giving 1/10, a tithe of one's income, is a very old human custom. It is before the Mosaic Law. It was a practice that was practiced by ancient peoples for a long time. And it's also, we need to understand that this was really tied in with an act of worship. And so when we talk about tithe, we're talking about the giving of 1/10 of one's income as an act of worship to God. Now, we also need to understand that as a Christian, I'm under the new covenant. I am not under the Mosaic covenant of the law. And I am not obligated to pay the 3 tithes required by the law. I don't have to give the general tithe to support the Levites. I don't have to give the festival tithe to provide for the festival meal. And I don't have to give the tithe for the poor. That's all Mosaic law. It's all a part of the requirements of the Mosaic law. And I am not under the law, but I am under grace. I'm not responsible to keep those 3 tithes as are Old Testament. Now, having said all that, I would say to you that it is a worthy goal for all of us to shoot for, to aim for, that we work to the point where we are giving 1/10 of your income as an act of worship. It's a worthy goal. To get to the point where you can take 1/10 of your income and give it to God. As an act, not because of some legalistic thing or that you might get a blessing, even though there is some acknowledgement of the fact that tithing will bring a blessing. But the motivation for giving the tithe is love for God. It is an act of worship, expression of love. And it is supposed to be a voluntary thing. But it's a worthy goal. You know, to shoot for. Obviously, as the statistics reveal, not many Christians reach the goal. On an optimistic view, 12% reach that goal, and the rest of the Christians fall far short. But nevertheless, it is a goal for us to shoot for. Not to keep the law, but because we love God. And we acknowledge that all our blessings flow from Him. Randy Alcorn, in his book, The Treasure Principle, observes, there is heated debate among Christians about whether tithing is still a starting place for giving. I have mixed emotions on this issue. I detest legalism. I certainly don't want to pour new wine into old wineskins, imposing the superseded First Covenant restrictions on Christians. Every New Testament example given goes far beyond the tithe. However, none falls short of it. Tithing isn't the ceiling of giving, it is the floor. It is not the finish line of giving, it is just the starting block. Tithes can be the training wheels to launch us into the mindset and skills and habits of grace. And so, I think it's a worthy challenge for all of us to stop and look and think about how much do you give to God. You see, it really has not so much how much you give, but whether you give with a heart. And so I would make it a real challenge to you to prayerfully consider giving a tithe, 1/10 of your income, to the Lord as an act of worship, really given by heart that loves Him. I give you that challenge. So, you know, tomorrow will be the first of the week. Many people will be getting their government checks. And so to stop and say, okay, here's the money I'm getting this month, and to take a tenth of that and give it to God. Many of you will probably at the end of the week be getting a paycheck from whatever your employer is, and to take a tenth of that and say, I give this to God. That's the challenge. Is it required? No. It is a voluntary thing. It is an expression of love for God. You see, it's not so much how much I give, but how I give. You remember Jesus told the story of watching the rich people put their money in the offering box, and then here comes this little lady, she puts in 2 pennies, and Jesus said she gave more than all the others. You see, perhaps the greatest thing is not how much I give, but whether I give. And perhaps the greatest offense is to come to worship God and not bring Him a gift. We take a love offering. It is an expression of an individual's love for God. And so then not to give a love gift is an offense. You maybe only put in 2 pennies. That's all you got is 2 pennies. But you give what you give because you love God. And so I would challenge you to stop and look at what you do. And I would challenge you to make it a goal to get to the point in your life where you give 10% of your income to God as an expression of your love for Him. And the promise is that He challenges them, particularly in Malachi, He challenges the people and He says, trust me and see me, try me. And see if I won't pour out the blessings of heaven upon you. We're going to close with that hymn as you listen to this challenge and you look at it and understand it.
Stand with me and let's sing 382. Trust me, try me, prove me.